Next slide. And with that, it is my distinct honor to present someone who is much more interesting than me to listen to, and that's Lord Christopher Monckton.
Next slide. My lords, that's me, ladies and gentlemen. Well, listening to Commissioner Rothschild, at last, for the first time, I've done what I've always wanted to do. I feel like a radical. What a splendid man he is. Come on, I want to hear a proper round of applause. But he is letting you down. Only 68% of Carroll County is Republican. We shall not rest, ladies and gentlemen, until 127%. Then we'll be doing the math the way they do it. Now, at the drafting committee for PlanFairyland, they would not call a spade because that would be too simple. No, they call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious lignometallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, for utilisation on the part of highly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or constructional trades or industries, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavational tasks or duties, and may from time to time be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, desirable, expedient, apposite, or germane, with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or, on the other hand, underfoot, Governor. But I'm going to make a few very simple points today. Because actually a lot of this global warming stuff is simple, and they have tried to make it look complicated. And we're going to make it look simple again. And we're going to start with this gentleman who gave the British a certain amount of trouble some time ago. And he said this, and you'll see this as the key quotation on the frieze around the rotunda where his statue now stands. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every tyranny over the mind of man. And the global warming scare is a tyranny over the mind of man. They talk of a so-called consensus. Well, I'll tell you what they mean by that. They mean a party line. And as you've just heard from the Commissioner, it is a Marxist party line, or a fascist party line, or a socialist party line, or a totalitarian party line. It is the antithesis of the freedom and democracy and prosperity for which Jefferson and the other founding fathers of this great country of yours stood and fought and died to make sure that you would have the freedoms that these people would, if they could, take away from you. And I'm delighted that the Commissioner and others here, indeed all of you here, are fighting and fighting and fighting again to stop them. Well, now let's start looking at a few of the main points of PlanFairyland insofar as it relates to global warming. And that's the focus of what I'm going to say today, because this is a first run-through of the quite detailed and rather dry presentation that I'm going to give to the elected officials on Monday. Now, what it says is, as greenhouse gas emissions are linked to climate change, Maryland and other coastal states need to ensure that they are reduced. More work needs to be done to curb greenhouse gas emissions throughout Maryland. Well, as I'll show, no, it doesn't. And what we're going to do is do what they didn't do. We're going to do a very simple, very basic, very traditional economic analysis. Let's go. We're going to make a few assumptions. We're going to assume that Sir Nicholas Stern, who did the most detailed work on how much global warming might cost, he says that to stop global warming, only 1% of global GDP over the 21st century. If we let it happen, at the rate at which the IPCC predicts, then it would cost 3% of global GDP. If it's twice as bad as the IPCC predicts, you're looking at 5 to 20% of global GDP would be spent on dealing with the climate damage that would arise. Those are his estimates. You'll see similar estimates by Garner. They're not quite so extreme. But I'm going to assume that we start with Stern as our benchmark. We are going to exclude all costs that are nothing to do with just mitigation of CO2 and the warming effect it has. We're going to assume that GDP growth rates and the welfare losses from climate inaction will be more or less in a straight line all the way through, uniform all the way through a century. In fact, of course, the first 2 or 3 degrees of warming, it's actually beneficial. We're going to pretend it isn't. And we're going to make a really big leap of faith by assuming that everything the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says is correct, only for the sake of argument. And the first point here is that there is what's called a climate sensitivity parameter. And this is the number which you use to multiply by the radiative forcing from a greenhouse gas to work out how much warming you're going to get over the next century. I'm testing you on this later, madam. And that value, as it happens, we're just lifting this out of the IPCC, is 0.5 Kelvin, which is the same thing as Celsius, or about 2 Fahrenheit, per watt per square metre of radiative forcing. Quite simple when you know how. And CO2, we're going to pretend that it represents 70% of all forcings. In other words, you take the warming from CO2 by the end of the century, and you increase it by 43% to take into account other greenhouse gases. In practice, the other greenhouse gases would maybe add another 10%. We're going to believe the IPCC's answer and pretend it's 43. On we go. So the case-specific economic assumptions we're making are that we're going to shut Maryland down completely, because that's what the plan ultimately is going to say. No motor cars, nobody living in the country, no agriculture, no septic tanks, no nothing. Back to the Stone Age, but without even the right to light a carbon-emitting fire in your caves. So we're going to shut down Maryland today. You're all out of a job. You all have no homes to go to. The lights will go out. You won't be able to hear me. There are some advantages. And we'll take this policy for 40 years and see what it does to global warming. Now, this will cut down, over those 40 years, 1.5% roughly of national US carbon emissions. They in turn represent 18.7% of global emissions. And that means that the fraction of global emissions that would be prevented by shutting down Maryland altogether today and keeping it that way for 40 years is just under 0.3%. So it's clearly not going to make that much difference. We're going to assume that CO2 concentration by 2050, if we didn't do anything to make global warming go away, would be 506 parts per million by volume. That's on the A2 IPCC scenario. We're going to assume that global annual GDP in 2010 was 60 trillion, that's going to grow at 3% a year, that we're going to apply a market discount rate of 5% a year. That means the cost of shutting Maryland down is the entire GDP of Maryland, adjusted in that fashion over the next 40 years. That comes to $8.1 trillion. That's what it costs globally to wipe Maryland off the map. So 8.1 trillion is what you're worth. So I think we'd rather keep you, but for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to get rid of you. So global GDP then, we work out over the period of this policy, is going to be something like $1.7 quadrillion. Those are the starting figures we need in order to do a proper economic appraisal. Virtually none of these figures appears in PlanFairyland or in the document called the Comprehensive Climate Change Nonsense, on which PlanFairyland is based. So on we go then. Would shutting down Maryland work? What difference is it going to make to global warming? We're not going to guess, we're going to calculate it. Here goes. Now, I'm sure that I need not explain this equation to you. It is entirely transparent and self-evident. But the answer, 0.0017 Celsius, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a Celsius degree. We use K for Kelvin because we're scientists and we're showing off. And that is less than 1,000th of a Fahrenheit degree in British and American measures. it's just pathetically little. And why is it so small? Well, because if you shut down Maryland altogether for 40 years, then in 2050, after that policy has been implemented, the CO2 concentration globally would fall from 506 parts per million by volume to, wait for it, 505.675. That's how laughable it all is. That's how laughable it all is. Next slide. Now we're going to work out how cost effective this measure is in reducing the global temperatures by 1 Celsius, or just under 2 Fahrenheit. And you'll be pleased to see it only costs $4.7 quadrillion to prevent 1 Celsius of global warming by measures as cost effective, or as you may think ineffective, as wiping Maryland off the map altogether. You can imagine how much less cost effective it would be to try to do anything less than wiping Maryland off the map altogether, which is what the plan proposes. On we go. So then, what will be the cost of abating all the warming that will happen over the next 40 years? Well, it's, in fact, that's about 1 Kelvin, so no surprises there. It's 4.1 quadrillion. That is $588,000 per head of global population over the next 40 years. Madam, I'll take your check now. And run off to Paraguay with it. Then we have, that's about 250% of the entire global gross domestic product, of everything that we make and sell throughout the period. That's how much it would cost just to make 1 Celsius of global warming go away. On we go. Now we're going to do a rather interesting thing, which is to work out how much it costs to sit back, enjoy the sunshine or the October snow. The Gore effect is working overtime here. And we're going to use a concept called discounting to present value, which is a standard economic method of appraisal which every industry uses when it's planning for the long term. So here goes. Now, Stern uses an artificially low discount rate of 0.1%. I won't bother to explain the theory of the Poisson theorem here. We'll just show that this is basically gibberish. And this is the gibberish which is lifted straight out of the Stern report. I put it there so that those of you who are economists can enjoy how completely absurd it is. A 0.1% discount rate is a joke. It is on that joke that the entire global warming scare, economically speaking, is founded. And we're going to show what a difference that joke makes to the figures. So on we go. Now we take the correct intertemporal discount rate, which is a minimum of 5%. And Václav Klaus says the reason for this, he's the President of the Czech Republic, very sound, proper conservative, undermining current economic development, which you do by using an artificially low interest rate, harms future generations. And if they're talking about the need to preserve future generations, the last thing you do is wreck the economy now. So the minimum market discount rate, says Klaus, is 5%. And he cites authorities on both sides of the global warming argument for that. And that is a very low rate. I would normally use 8 or 12. We're going to use 5. We're going to be as nice to the bedwetters as we can. It's be nice to bedwetters week. So on we go. So what's the cost of doing nothing? We can now, we've got a discount rate of 5%, we can work this out. We start with Stern's figures. And what we have to do is convert Stern's cost of various climate actions into a real cost after allowing for the fact that here we use a 0.1% intertemporal discount rate, and we're going to use the correct minimum rate, which is 5%. And to convert between those two rates, that even simpler equation up there is how an economist would do this. And what it shows at the bottom line is that Stern's 20% cost of GDP, of the whole of GDP over the 20th century, which would be gobbled up if global warming was really bad, comes down to just 1.5% of GDP the moment we use the correct discount rate. But suppose we then look at the 3% of GDP that he says it would cost if the IPCC is right in saying we're going to get, say, 3 Celsius of warming over the next century. That comes down to 0.2% of global GDP. That is the cost of doing absolutely nothing about the climate at all for 100 years, and then taking the damage that would result from doing nothing for 100 years. 0.2% of global GDP. That's what a difference. Changing the discount rate from the bogus rate that he used to the correct rate that I've used. That's the difference it makes. On we go. So now we can look at various discount rates here, various inaction costs, if you like, ranging from stern at the top down to the market rate at the bottom. And the market rate is the one that any economist would use. And essentially we're looking at 0.4 to 0.2 to 1.5% of GDP. That's the cost of doing nothing, even if the most extreme climatic results were to occur. On we go. So that means that, and you'll love this, that the cost of shutting down Maryland altogether for 40 years, that would be 1,000 times more expensive than the cost of simply doing nothing and allowing sea level to rise and all the other disasters that they imagine. It's 1,000 times more expensive to do nothing, to take action on the climate than it is to do nothing. And as a person who used to do investment appraisals for Margaret Thatcher, on the whole, I think I would probably recommend against this one. And indeed, it doesn't actually matter very much what discount rate you take. Even if we take Stern's 0.1% discount rate at the left there, still at the 3% of GDP cost he imagines, you're looking at, it's still nearly 100 times more expensive to shut Maryland down completely than simply to do nothing about the climate at all. On we go. So there is a summary of the effect of going all the way with PlanFairyland and shutting your state down altogether. 0.0017 Celsius of warming forestalled, cost of $4 or $5 quadrillion to forestall 1 Celsius of warming. That's going to cost nearly $600,000 per head of global population, and it's going to be somewhere around 170 to 1,100 times more expensive to take action to make global warming go away than to do nothing. So the economic conclusions are very straightforward. On we go. Is CO2 mitigation cost effective? No, it isn't. There are 3 bands of estimates here. At the top in red, you've got the cost of the predictions made by governments, the US Cap and Trade Bill, the UK government's estimate of things, the Canada coal regulations. All of these are things they suggested in advance. They said, we think this will happen. Even those come out at around 10 times more expensive to take action about the climate than to do nothing and pay the cost of the damage and adapt in a focused way. If you look at real-world policies where they've actually put them into effect so we know what they're costing and they can't get away with the, I'm going to use a rude word, ladies block your ears, bullshit, then you'll see it's around 100 times more expensive. That's the green figures, they're 100 times more expensive to make global warming go away than to do nothing. But you'll see that abolishing Maryland, down the bottom there, comes in the Fairyland category, where this is the political gesture politics, where a state of the US thinks that by taking climate action it's going to save the world from rising sea levels. It's just pathetic when you think about it. And you can see they are into 1,000 to even 10,000 times more expensive to take action than not take action if you go down the route of gesture politics, which is what the Maryland plan actually is. And so now PlanMaryland, that's the economic case, and it's really a very straightforward one. Now, I'm conscious that we are running a little bit out of time. I could go through the other points on this plan now, or I could stop and carry on with the rest of the agenda. Which would people like me to do? Let's take a vote. Hands up for Monckton carrying on. Hands up for Monckton shutting up. See me afterwards. All right, I'll carry on, but I'll be very quick about it. I'm going to go through another few assertions made in the Maryland plan. We've dealt with the economic assertion that something must be done because we've got to save the planet, blah, blah, blah. We've seen what complete, I mean, really hysterically, hilariously bad nonsense that was. Now we're going to go on. And this is their proposal for a 25% reduction in statewide greenhouse gas emissions from 2006 levels by 2020. And you now have a law on the statute book of Maryland that says they've got to achieve this. The King-Canute law, I call it. Here we go. The GGRA, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. Over 10 years, you reduce global emissions by 0.035%. Oh, look. Marvellous, CO2 concentration will fall. This is calculation based on the IPCC's own methods. And nothing wrong with any of this. From 412 parts per million down to 411.992. That will forestall 0.00005 1.5 Kelvin, or 1/20,000th of a Celsius degree. It's about 1/10,000th of a Fahrenheit degree, and that is 1/1000th of the minimum threshold below which no detection of global warming forestalled can be measured by any modern method or instrument. So even if this policy were to work, they'd have absolutely no way of knowing that it had. And here we have the cost to Maryland of, I've just been talking about state climate policies, if you can call them policies. I mean, it's a joke, frankly, but then there's the federal ones. And this is done by a manufacturers grouping, so I don't warrant that I've checked the numbers and that they're correct, but it does indicate that you have a very heavy cost in extra gasoline prices and losses of income. And that's when you pile the federal costs on top of the statewide costs that Maryland is trying to impose. It's a double whammy. On we go. Now, here's the thing. The policies such as shutting down Maryland, or the 25% reduction by 2020 we've just looked at, these are actually going to be even less cost effective than the figures I have shown you would suggest. Because we're assuming, actually impossibly, that policies will mitigate as much CO2 emission as is claimed for them. We're also assuming that if the CO2 residence time is 125 years, that's how long it stays in the atmosphere once you put it there, well, there's not going to be any mitigation of CO2-caused global warming this century at all, is there? Doesn't matter what you do about it. And then, of course, all essential capital costs are omitted, as are the opportunity losses from taking away money from where it could do some good and spending it where it can't do any good at all. So, the summary on the economic front then is that no policy to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, reducing or replacing CO2 will prove cost-effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. It isn't worth doing. CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective. If they're costly enough to be effective, they will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation to any climate change that may occur, in whatever direction it may occur, and only to the extent that it may occur, and only when and where it occurs, would be orders of magnitude cheaper and more cost effective. Since the cost of the premium exceeds the cost of the risk, don't insure. I told you these points would be obvious. Come on, I think we should have a round of applause for that. Aren't you an obedient lot? So now, PlanMaryland says that compact development, this is putting people in little boxes in cities, packed one on the other like eggshells, leads people to drive 20 to 40% less at minimal or reduced cost, and low density development and roadway expansion, on the other hand, would increase vehicle usage, a major component of greenhouse gas emissions. Doesn't it make you shiver? So here is just one rather inconvenient fact that they don't seem to know about this compact development that runs all the way through PlanFairyland. Per capita total energy consumption is higher in cities than it is in the countryside. It's not just the motor cars. You have to get up into your egg box in an elevator. We would call it a lift. We don't have an elevator operator giving us his opinion that there's a 78% chance of precipitation in the later part of the day. We say the lift man says it's going to rain. Next slide. So, sea level rise. This is, oh yeah, sea level rise. But of course you are on a low-lying coastline which is subsiding, because there's a meteor impact crater beneath Chesapeake Bay where there is compaction going on. You also have isostatic recovery since the last ice age. Are you following me closely here? And as a result of all these factors, the coastline of Maryland is sinking, and that makes it look as though sea level in Maryland is rising. And of course, sea level genuinely worldwide is rising, but not by the sort of lurid figures of 1.4 feet by 2050 and 3.4 feet by 2100 that you'll see in PlanFairyland. There's even an estimate in there that it might be 5 to 10 feet by 2100. Whatever they're on, I want some. Let's look at the actual data from the real world. This is the Aviso Envisat. It's the latest satellite to go up. And there you can see the seasonal fluctuations in sea level with a generally rising trend. But if you look at the little figure at the top of the screen, the slope equals 0.498 millimeters per year. Well, heaven knows what a millimeter is, but let's put this into English. Next slide. Since 2004, sea level has been rising, according to the latest satellite, at a rate equivalent to, wait for it, 2 inches per century. Now, how many of you have seen that in any mainstream news media? Isn't that 2 inches per century? Golly gosh. But let's see, there's an even more recent satellite that's been put up. It was put up and began reporting in 2008. Shall we have a look at what that says? Here goes. Sea level fall for the last 3 years. And they haven't told you that either. You won't find any of this data in PlanFairyland, because we're in the real world here, and they are in, as the name suggests, fairyland. On we go. Then, worsening coastal storms, storm surges, other extreme weather events. Oh, reach for your hats, try and hold them on. Here goes. Well, look at it. It is very frightening. Look at that figure for 2005. That, of course, was Hurricane Katrina that caused mainly that surge there. But you can see that the serious storms, the one that does do the damage that are in black there, no trend whatsoever right across the period. A little bit of an increase in the tropical storms and hurricanes that are not so serious. Why? Chiefly because of better reporting systems. If a hurricane, a bad hurricane hits you, you know about it, and you knew about it 100 years ago. If a tropical storm passes over, you might not even notice, whereas now you would record it. So there's a recording bias which accounts partly for this increase in the tropical storms. But let's look at the overall index of tropical cyclone activity right around the world. This is tropical cyclones, typhoons and hurricanes. It's a complicated index compiled by my friend Dr. Ryan Maui at Florida State University, and it's based on summing over a 2-year running sum the frequency, intensity and duration of all these tropical big storms around the world. And at the beginning of 2011, it was at its lowest level since records began. And unadjusted hurricane losses, doesn't it look terrible? Correct for increases in population in harm's way, next slide, and you see it's all really not a picture to be excited about. Far worse in 1926 than it was even with Katrina in 2005. Changing precipitation patterns. In other words, it's either going to rain more, or it's going to rain less, or it's going to rain in different places. Frankly, so what? But anyway, there is Maryland's precipitation in inches over the last 100 years. Not exactly a huge trend in either direction. On we go. There's the drought severity index. Once again, neither droughts nor wetness are showing any great sign of change over the whole of the period record. And so then, hotter summers. Oh dear, now, hands up all those who would not like hotter summers. Well, there you are. They're trying to say this is going to kill people. Well, no, because mortality from hotter summers, despite the increase in temperatures we've seen over the last 30 years, which is mainly natural, have in fact plummeted, particularly in the eastern states, as you see there with those 3 histograms for 3 different periods coming more recently. On we go. And in case you think that tropical diseases are going to spread, no they're not. There was the prevalence of malaria in 1882 and 1912, that was long before global warming, and malaria is disappearing. On we go. And West Nile virus, nothing to do with global warming because it's spreading even to the cold states as well as the warm ones. And then, number 8 out of 10, we're very nearly finished here now, agriculture. And look what has happened as global warming over the last 50 years of in fact nearly a Celsius degree, and look at the yields of both corn and of soybeans in Maryland according to your Department of Commerce. Hardly the picture of a declining industry because of global warming, is it? Next slide. Temperature change and its adverse impacts. Well, this is fascinating. There has been an increase in temperature in Maryland over the last 100 years or so. Get used to it. It's rather nice. But that increase, in fact, is at a rate 1/4 of the increase between 1695 and 1735 that occurred in central England. And that was, of course, long before the Industrial Revolution even began. And global warming over the first decade of the 21st century is as near zero as makes no difference, according to the combined 2 satellite records. That red line shows what's happening. Now, next one. Then we have the consensus on climate science. They say it's real and honest. Yep, that's what they assume, and you have to have a really straight face to believe that one. Let's just have a look at the untrustworthy IPCC. Here is what the scientists have said. Yes, I'm going to take 2 more minutes. Just sit back, relax, enjoy. This is all valuable stuff. So, here we are. This is the before. This is what the scientists said. When will a man-made effect on climate change be identified? It's not surprising that the best estimate is we don't know. It's very honest of them. This is what got published. The body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on global climate, and they ask us to take them seriously. Then we go on to the fraudulent IPCC 2007. Here is a sine wave. Now, madam, you know what a sine wave is, don't you? Well, never mind. There it is, that's a sine wave. Its trend, by definition, is like this, 0. That's it, very good. It neither rises nor falls in the long term, it just wiggles up and down all the way. Now, if we take just this segment of a sine wave, then the trend of it is slightly downwards. Next one, more downwards. Next one, starting from that arrow and moving to the right. And you'll see again it's still more declining, and then even steeper decline. And if we looked at that and used this method, we'd say, ooh, we've got a terrible thing happening to this sine wave, it's plummeting. Well, of course we know this is nonsense, but supposing we took a different segment of the sine wave, which we'll do now, oh, it's all right, it's in fact soaring. Now you may think, what's this got to do with the temperature? Watch. That is the temperature record for the last 150 years, perfectly accurately represented, except that some idiot has overlaid it with 4 trend lines, just like the ones we've shown, and has drawn the conclusion 3 times in different places in the report that the rate of global warming is itself accelerating and that we are to blame. That, ladies and gentlemen, is scientific fraud, plain and simple. That central conclusion of the IPCC's report is wrong. That's the graph as it was when it was submitted, quite correctly, by the scientists. Somebody tampered with it. On we go. And indeed, we could play with that same graph. We could show precisely the opposite result. If you take the warming rate between 1905 and 1945, it is twice as bad as between 1905 and 2005. Global warming is over, ladies and gentlemen. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a quick vote. How many of you think that the IPCC's conclusion is correct? No. Hands up those who think that this conclusion is correct. There's always a few. If I use the same technique on the same data and come to an opposite result, it tells you the technique is a bogus technique, and that's the only reason I show you that slide. On we go. Here's the true picture. We have 3 regular periods of warming, exactly at the same rate, all 3 of them. I actually had a question put down in the House of Lords to confirm this. This is a correct result. And there's the global warming again over the last 10 years, not much of it, as you can see. And indeed, the usual suspects are beginning to admit this, and they're worried about it. And this guy's latest theory is, it's gone into hiding. It's in the ocean. It's hiding away from us. And it's going to come out and say, boom. So, now we just sum up very quickly with the PlanMaryland report card. There are the various aspects of the plan that we have looked at to do with global warming. And you'll see that we give them 0 out of 10. This plan is a failure. So now to the conclusion. No more can the governor of Maryland stop the sea from rising than King Canute did. And when he tried to stop it, he said, look, verily, my flatterers, we hold not so much power as you believe. Mind you well, then, that reigneth one only king, he that is almighty, he that governeth the sea and holdeth the ocean in the hollow of his hand. Keep ye then your praises unto him alone. Underlying this joke, this Maryland plan so-called, is a very serious point, that your freedom is being taken away. And they're using the environment as an excuse, and they're making people look away from the very straightforward calculations and data which I have put before you very briefly today. And I hope, therefore, that you will be the spearheads of a movement to fight back against this nonsense. And I'm going to end with the words of Longfellow, cited by Winston Churchill at the darkest hour before the dawn in the Second World War. For I love your country, and I don't want it to be brought down by this nonsense. This is Longfellow's words. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging, breathless, on thy fate. Thank you.